Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's video. On today's video, we're continuing with part 3 of our 5-part series on the game show quiz. And we're reviewing some of the important labor codes and California codes of regulation that are most important to the work that we do as qualified medical evaluators. Now, there's hundreds and hundreds of labor codes and codes of regulation that we could review, but I've taken the time to go through all of them and pick out those specific codes and regulations that have the most relevance to the day-to-day operation of the qualified medical evaluator. And in parts 1 and 2 of this series, we spent some time talking about those labor codes that are involved with making our phone ring as qualified medical evaluators. When our phone rings and the party on the other end of the phone requests a QME evaluation, it's because there's been some dispute that has arisen, either related to, number one, the compensability of the injury, number two, either due to the existence and or extent of permanent impairment or the need for future medical care, or number three, what we simply refer to as other medical issues. Now, each of those different types of disputes are governed by a specific labor code. And we talked about Labor Code 4060 for the compensability disputes, Labor Code 4061 for the permanent impairment and need for future medical care disputes, and then Labor Code 4062 for all other medical disputes. In today's game show quiz, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk to you about Labor Code 139.2. And 139.2 has to deal with some separate and distinct issues, and I don't want to give those away to you just now before we get into our game show. But Labor Code 139.2 does elaborate a little bit more on some of the concepts that we talked about in Labor Codes 4060, 4061, and 4062. So it's a beautiful code to illustrate a couple key principles for us as QMEs. And then in our very next session, I want to talk to you about Labor Code 4628. And when we wrap up that final session on Labor Code 4628, we're then going to move on to some different topics, and we're going to review specifically the labor codes and regulations that are involved with the face-to-face evaluation, and we'll do that in one separate discussion. And then in two separate and distinct sessions, we're going to talk about the labor codes and regulations that govern the production of our QME reports. So at the end of this series, at the conclusion of this series of discussions, your face-to-face evaluation, your QME reports, and your procedures in general, and specifically your attention to specific legal detail. Your attention to specific legal detail is going to be infinitely improved. And in that way, you can confidently know that you're complying with all the regulations and requirements that govern the work that we do, and that your work in no way, shape, or form will come under scrutiny of disciplinary committees, and that's exactly what we want. We want to be able to breathe easy knowing that we're doing a fabulous job, that we're hitting all the high notes, dotting all the I's, crossing all the T's, and we're doing our work as it's designed to be done, and we're doing it exactly to the letter of the regulations and the labor codes. In that way, you can produce reports that comply with all the requirements and actually resolve, imagine that, actually resolve the disputes that are pending. And that's really all anyone cares about, is that these disputes get resolved so that we can all go forward with our jobs and all go forward with our lives. So pay close attention and take notes to the subtle nuances that I share with you regarding each of these codes. Because what we're going to do is we're going to go over the codes according to the letter as they're written. And then I'm also going to share with you some subtle applications and subtle nuances of these codes and show you how these codes are used to your benefit, so that you can become better at what you do in accordance with the letter of the law. Okay? So with that as our introduction today, let's move on now, and let's go through a couple questions regarding Labor Code 139.2. Okay, so let's begin. We're over here today in this column, and we're going to focus our attention on Labor Code 139.2 and have 5 questions for you today. So let's begin with the easiest section, Labor Code 139.2 for 10 points. Tell me, is this true or false? Labor Code 139.2 has as its main focus that it deals with the timelines for the submission of QME reports. Is that true or is that false? Well, that's actually false because timelines for the submission of QME reports is discussed in California Code of Regulations 38. And we're going to get into California Code of Regulations number 38 when we get into our discussion about the codes and regulations that deal with the production of our QME reports. So stay tuned for that. We are going to thoroughly handle all the issues related to timelines related to our reports. But in Labor Code 139.2, we're dealing with a different issue. In Labor Code 139.2 deals with the appointment and the reappointment of QMEs. So if you're watching this discussion and you're not yet a QME, the requirements for appointment as a QME in the first place are dealt with in Labor Code 139.2. And if you're already a QME seeking reappointment, either now or in the very near future, within the next 2 years, that is, the requirements for reappointment as a QME are also discussed in this section. So I want to pull out from this section a couple of key sections of this code that are of immediate interest and concern to either non-QMEs who want to become QMEs or QMEs who want to be able to continue and be reappointed every 2 years as QMEs. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so let's go to Labor Code 139.2 for 20 points, please. Okay, true or false? Under Labor Code 139.2, the requirements for appointment as a QME for MDs, for DCs, for DOs, and psychologists is the same. Is that true or is that false? In other words, aside from the different specialties and the different type of knowledge that a medical doctor has compared to a psychologist, or that a psychologist has to a chiropractor, aside from that, are the requirements for initial appointment, are they the same or are they dramatically different? Well, that is false because the requirements are dramatically different, and medical doctors and doctors of osteopathy have certain requirements for appointment as a qualified medical evaluator. Requirements for chiropractors are described in a separate and distinct section, and those of a psychologist are described in a third separate and distinct section. So let's just review these for our own reminder and our own education. For medical doctors are required to be board certified in a specialty by a board which is recognized both by the medical director and either the Medical Board of California for medical doctors or the Osteopathic Medical Board of California. So important word within this description is the word and. The board has to be recognized both by the Professional Licensing Board and then also by the Administrative Director of the Division of Workers' Compensation. Number two, the MD and DO has to successfully complete a residency training program. Residency training program accredited by the Council for Graduate Medical Education, or the equivalent accrediting body within the Osteopathic Medical Board of California. Well, if the medical doctor or doctor of osteopathy was an active medical qualified medical evaluator on June 30, 2000, that qualifies for appointment as a QME. Or if either the MD or DO has qualifications that the administrative director and either the Medical Board of California or the Osteopathic Medical Board deem to be appropriate, or are equivalent to board certification in a specialty, that would also qualify for appointment as a QME. For chiropractic doctors are required to become certified in California Workers' Compensation evaluation by a provider recognized by the administrative director. And I myself am a chiropractor, and I know that when I became certified in California Workers' Compensation, I took a course through what was then known as the Los Angeles College of Chiropractic. It's now known as Southern California University of Health Sciences. And I mention those names simply as an example of a provider who's recognized by the administrative director. Typically, it's a provider that is one of the chiropractic colleges, but not in every instance, but generally. The certification program shall include instruction on disability evaluation report writing that meets the standards set forth in paragraph 1. And now this is an interesting nuance for chiropractors. Medical doctors and doctors of osteopathy and psychologists need to complete a 12-hour course in QME report writing, whereas chiropractic doctors, the report writing instruction is contained within the course of California Workers' Compensation evaluation. And typically this involves a 44-hour course of instruction in various topics related to California Workers' Compensation, and it includes at least 12 hours on production of the QME report. For medical doctors, doctors of osteopathy, and psychologists, that 12-hour QME report writing course is a separate and distinct course, because as we'll see, or as we've already seen with regards to medical doctors and doctors of osteopathy, there is no required course work in California Workers' Compensation evaluation required. Nowhere within these requirements does it say that they have to take a course in California Workers' Compensation. But the chiropractors do. The chiropractors do not have to take the 12-hour report writing course, but the medical doctors, doctors of osteopathy, and the psychologists do have to take a 12-hour course in report writing. For psychologists, psychologists have to meet one of the following. They are board certified in clinical psychology by a board recognized by the administrative director, or number 2, they hold a doctoral degree in psychology, or a doctoral degree which is deemed equivalent for licensure by the Board of Psychology from a university or professional school recognized by the administrative director, and this is interesting, has not less than 5 years postdoctoral experience in the diagnosis and treatment of emotional and mental disorders. Now, this requirement does not pertain to chiropractors, does not pertain to medical doctors and doctors of osteopathy, but for psychologists, the administrative director requires that you have at least 5 years of clinical experience in the diagnosis and treatment of emotional and mental disorders. Or has not less than 5 years postdoctoral experience in the diagnosis and treatment of emotional and mental disorders, and has served as an agreed medical evaluator on 8 or more occasions prior to January 1, 1990. Well, the number of doctors who have served as an AME on 8 or more occasions prior to 1/1/1990 is a diminishing population. So requirement number C is becoming less and less commonly qualified for, I guess is the way to describe that. Most psychologists will qualify to become qualified medical evaluators under requirement A and B. So it's kind of interesting, depending upon your professional licensure, your path to becoming a qualified medical evaluator differs greatly, both in coursework required and clinical experience required. I'm sort of the belief that all doctors should have at least 5 or maybe even 10 years of clinical practice, but the administrative director does not agree because he or she has not included that in the regulations. Only the psychologists are required to have at least 5 years postdoctoral experience. I, of course, would like to see doctors of chiropractic, medical doctors, and doctors of osteopathy have at least 5 years of clinical experience, but that is not the position of the administrative director. Okay? Okay, let's move on to our next question. Labor Code 139.2 for 30 points, please. A QME, is this true or false? A QME can be denied reappointment if it's demonstrated that he or she writes, quote unquote, bad reports. Bad reports. Well, what is a bad report? How does a report qualify as bad? What is a bad report? And if a doctor writes bad reports, can he be allowed to continue to go on writing bad reports, or can his reappointment be upheld? Well, that's actually true. That's actually true. The administrative director is concerned about having doctors who write good reports that resolve the issues that are in dispute. So let's read Section D of Labor Code 139.2. It says that the QME shall be reappointed if he or she meets the following criteria. And this criteria has to do with your reports. So this is not the only criteria that you have to qualify for in order to be reappointed, but this is the one criteria that relates to your reports. So let's review this. It says that the QME has not had more than 5 of his or her evaluations that were considered by a workers' compensation administrative law judge at a contested hearing rejected. Has not had more than 5 of his reports rejected by the workers' compensation administrative law judge or the appeals board during the most recent 2-year period during which the physician served as a qualified medical evaluator. If the workers' compensation administrative law judge or the appeals board rejects the QME's report on the basis that it fails to meet the minimum standards for those reports established by the administrative director or the appeals board, the workers' compensation administrative law judge or the appeals board, as the case may be, shall make a specific finding to that effect and shall give notice to the medical evaluator and to the administrative director. So in a separate section, we're going to talk about all of the codes of regulation and labor codes that govern the production of our QME report. And the reason that there are codes and regulations that govern the QME report is to ensure that our reports meet certain minimum standards and minimum requirements for the resolution of disputes within the workers' compensation system. If you fail to meet those minimum standards and have your reports rejected, you're on the way to losing your QME credential. Now, I'm in wholehearted agreement with this section of Labor Code 139.2 because in my entire career, since 1995, over 20 years of doing QME reports, as far as I know, I've never had a single report rejected. Not one single report. And I don't say that to indicate that my reports are anything spectacular, but I simply mention that to contrast that in this section allows up to 5 bad reports before your QME credential can be denied reappointment. So in my opinion, that's a very generous allowance within a 2-year time period. That's a very generous allowance. You can have as many as 4 bad, crappy, terrible, awful, below standard reports before the administrative director can deny you reappointment. And the whole purpose of this program is to make sure that your reports never end up in the rejected bin so that your reports stay out of the scrutiny of disciplinary committees. So I really want to get your attention and make sure that you are with me for the remainder of this program so that you can confidently practice as a qualified medical evaluator for just about as long as you decide you want to do that. Okay? Okay, let's go on to our next question. Okay, Labor Code 139.2 now for 40 points, please. True or false? Under Labor Code 139.2, your appointment as a QME is tied and linked to your status with your professional licensing authority. Now, in my case, I'm a chiropractor, so my professional licensing authority is the Board of Chiropractic Examiners. But if you're a psychologist or a medical doctor or an osteopath, you have your own professional licensing authority. So should our appointment as a QME, should it be related to our status as, in my case, as a chiropractor, or in your case, as a psychologist? Should it be tied and linked, or should they be separate and unlinked? Well, that's actually true. It's true. And the code section reads as follows. It says that the administrative director may, in his or her discretion, suspend or terminate a QME during his or her term of appointment without a hearing when either of the following conditions occur. And we're just elaborating here on one of the conditions. And that is that the evaluator's license to practice in California has been suspended by the relevant licensing authority so as to preclude practice, or has been revoked or terminated by the licensing authority. So a suspension, a revocation, or a termination by, in my case, the Board of Chiropractic Examiners is sufficient for the administrative director of the Division of Workers' Compensation to tell me that, hey, I cannot practice as a qualified medical evaluator. Now, that seems like it should make some sense, but I want to elaborate on this a little bit more and share with you some of the built-in gravity of this section of Labor Code 139.2. And this goes a little bit beyond Labor Code 139.2 and introduces a discussion about the relevant licensing authority. Now, I can't speak for the medical board or the osteopathic board or the psychology board, but I can tell you that for the chiropractic board, The chiropractic board is concerned that its licensed practitioners, doctors of chiropractic, that they maintain high standards and that they be good boys and girls, not only within the four walls of their treating office, but also within the global atmosphere out in the public, so to speak. And I recently produced some continuing education programs for chiropractors where I reviewed the terms of revocation, suspension, and termination for chiropractors. And they're quite broad, and let me tell you, they extend far beyond the walls of your office. So transgressions, errors, and omissions out in the general public. For example, at public gatherings or at bars or at the post office or at the grocery store, or any misdemeanors or felony offenses outside of the chiropractic office are sufficient for revocation, suspension, or termination of the professional chiropractic license. So for both the licensing authority and also the Division of Workers' Compensation, those regulatory bodies are concerned that we maintain high standards in our professional practices and also in our personal lives. So I want to encourage you to be a model citizen, really. And this is offered to you without exaggeration, that you be a model citizen in your personal life, because any transgression could directly jeopardize not only your professional license, but also your qualified medical evaluator credential. And there's much written about this, and I don't think we have to go into much more detail than that. But suffice to say that you are required to be good boys and girls and model citizens and above legal transgressions, even in your personal life, in order to be able to continue to do your work as a licensed professional and also as a qualified medical evaluator. So I think that point, I hope that point has fallen on fertile ears. Okay, and let's go now to our final question. Labor Code 139.2 now for 50 points. Is this true or false? And this relates back to the QME panel process, which we discussed in great detail under Labor Code 4060, 4061, and 4062. But even in Labor Code 139.2, there's some mention of the QME panel process. So let me ask you, true or false, if an employee requests a panel of QMEs and the panel is not assigned within 20 days, it's because priority is being given to represented employees. In other words, there's a backlog, the panel has not been issued, and priority is being given to represented employees. If you're an unrepresented injured worker, you therefore have no recourse but to sit tight and wait for the issuance of your 3-doctor panel. Is that true or is that false? Well, that's actually false, and the opposite scenario is actually the prevailing scenario. Section H number 1 says that when requested by an employee or an employer pursuant to section 4062.1, and we talked all about 4062.1 already, the medical director shall assign 3-member panels of qualified medical evaluators within 5 working days after receiving a request for a panel. Preference in assigning panels shall be given to cases in which the employee is not represented. So our question involved represented injured workers, but actually the law requires preference to be assigned to unrepresented injured workers. And if the panel is not issued within 20 working days, the unrepresented injured worker has the authority to move forward, and you may get phone calls from unrepresented injured workers who are requesting you to do their evaluation. And the authority for that is further described in this section, H-1. It says if a panel is not assigned within 20 working days, the employee shall have the right to obtain a medical evaluation from any qualified medical evaluator of his or her choice within a reasonable geographic area. And you're going to get these calls. You're going to get these calls. Make sure you check out the timelines and make sure that the timelines comply with all of these requirements. If all of the timeline requirements are met and the panel has not been issued, then you have the authority to move ahead and accept this phone call and accept this appointment and go ahead and make the appointment. And then, as we already know, and this relates to the QME panels, the medical director shall use a random selection method for assigning panels. The medical director shall select evaluators who are specialists of the type requested by the employee. And then remember, we talked in Labor Code sections 4061, 4061, and then also 4062 that the employee has the first right of selection of the specialty to provide the medical evaluation. So here that point is reiterated by stating that the medical director shall provide specialists of the type requested by the employee. So the employee has priority of the panels and also has priority as to selecting the specialist to perform the evaluation. And then finally, the employee has another benefit, and that is that the employee has the opportunity to consult with his or her primary treating physician prior to deciding which type of specialist to request. And if you are a primary treating physician, this is an important discussion to have with your patient who is pending a qualified medical evaluation. You have the opportunity to counsel your patient as to what type of specialist they are entitled to have perform their qualified medical evaluation. Okay? So the take-home message here is that unrepresented injured workers have a lot of power when it comes to the selection of a panel of qualified medical evaluators. Okay? And let's wrap this section up. Okay, doctors, so let's conclude today's discussion on Labor Code 139.2. 139.2 is important to us because if you're not a qualified medical evaluator, it tells you the terms and conditions required to qualify to become a qualified medical evaluator. If you're already a qualified medical evaluator, then your term of appointment is for 2 years. At the conclusion of the 2-year time period, you have to reappoint as a qualified medical evaluator, and Section 139.2 gives us the exact requirements that we have to meet and fulfill in order to qualify for reappointment. So you should become familiar with 139.2 in addition to the sections that we reviewed in today's discussion. For the purpose of today's discussion, I want to impress upon you that one of the terms of reappointment is that you produce good reports. If you're found to produce bad reports, you're not going to be reappointed as a qualified medical evaluator. Now, the administrative director provides a very generous buffer and a very generous cushion for us in that she requires that you have at least 5 reports rejected before your credential comes under scrutiny. And in my opinion, that's an extremely generous buffer. If you're writing reports that are so bad that you have 5 reports rejected within a 2-year period, you're in the wrong business. you're not doing work to even minimum standards, and you should have your QME credential revoked. So the purpose of bringing this up is to get your attention. And I want to get your attention for our upcoming sessions. In our upcoming sessions, we're going to talk exactly about this topic, and that is how to produce your QME reports in a way that does meet the minimum standards and complies with all the requirements of the labor codes and the regulations that govern the QME report. So that's coming up in just a couple of days. Before we get to that, we have one more session in our game show quiz where we're going to talk about Labor Code Section 4628, which is another code that contains several critical sections that we need to be aware of as qualified medical evaluators. So for today's session, I want to let you know it's been my pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to being with you on our very next session. For now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.